Hello members, welcome and good evening. Thank you all of you for joining tonight, and for those of you watching on YouTube, be it live or on recording, welcome to you as well. I am really excited about this evening. It's the first in what I hope will be a series of events with sample kits that celebrate not only our museum release wines but also our fine wine releases. And I worked very diligently, tough job, with Sean Chinon, our fine wine manager, to come up with this evening's selection. And I'm thrilled that Pierre Mansour, our director of wine, who's just joining us here, is going to be tasting this evening and presenting and talking about the wines and about how wines age. So before I do the technical introduction, Pierre, cheers and good evening. Cheers, all members. I hope that you have filled up your glasses. I'll quickly start by saying if you are tasting along with packs and you haven't poured your wine yet, I do encourage you to do so. The packs look like this. If you haven't opened them yet, hopefully you have and they're poured. But if not, I strongly recommend, as the email said, peeling off the corner and then using a pair of scissors rather than a tear. We've had a few accidents and spilt wine on laptops with a tear. So just chop the edge off and pour relatively quickly. It shouldn't make a mess in theory, and it's definitely an art. Once you've perfected it, it's rather easy. As I've also mentioned before, if you're only pouring half of your serve this evening or a portion, I think I've gone for about 2/3, please feel free to stack them up in the fridge. I've mentioned on events like this before, but they stack really nicely on the fridge door. Just pop your milk on the side so that when you open the door, you don't knock them over, which is, again, one of those arts that you perfect. So if you haven't joined an event at all with us at the Wine Society before, because I know we have got some newbies today, first of all, there is a chat button. You can see that people are already using it to let us know where they are and what they're drinking. Some people I have noticed though are being just hosts and panelists. If you do that, you will only be speaking to myself, Pierre, and the lovely Catherine from the tastings team who's behind the scenes. Hello, Catherine. Instead, please select everyone, because when you select everyone, all your fellow members will be able to see your messages. Other than that, we also have a Q&A this evening. Q&A is great for asking questions. We're going to be, Pierre and I will feed Pierre questions as and hopefully during the course of the evening. But if you have a burning question we can't answer, we will get that sent over email afterwards, but hopefully we'll be able to answer as we go. Catherine's going to be monitoring those. Please do use the Q&A. And then last but not least, we've got a poll at the end. So if you're tasting in a group, we've selected multiple choice. We've had feedback. It's not fair to only have one. But please make sure that you save, tick, smiley face, whatever it might be, your favorite of the 6, and we will have a poll at the end because we'd love to know what you think. So without further ado, I'm too excited to try these wines. I'm going to hand over to Pierre Mansour and say another cheers. And I'm very excited, Pierre. So good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Anna. Good evening, everyone. Cheers. I hope you've all poured your 6 wines. I certainly have enjoyed doing that. I've had a little a snifter of all 6 and a little taste of all 6 too. I couldn't resist because on paper this is quite a special tasting that we've got lined up, which really celebrates, I think, one of the great pleasures of wine, which is aged wine. And I'm sure that many of you will have had moments where you've come across an aged wine and it has knocked you for 6 because it's just been absolutely gorgeous to drink. I suspect that there are some of you who are still learning or trying to find that mythical aged wine that sort of hits you right in the middle of the head and goes, wow, this is something quite special. Between Anna and myself, what we're going to try to do this evening, we are going to really sort of focus mainly on what happens to wine as it ages. Why do certain wines age and others don't age? What's the secret behind aging wines? We'll be able to share some facts with you, But just to manage your expectations, I'm afraid there is no silver bullet when it comes to aged wines, in the sense of being able to pick a wine at that perfect moment when it's reached its utter sort of peak of drinkability. There is some science behind it, but there are so many variables, not least you yourself, in terms of your own taste and your own personal expectation around wine. I always tell the story that my father, who is Lebanese, I don't know if it's got anything to do with him being Lebanese, but he loves drinking young, fine wines. Those are the sorts of wines that really, really appeal to him. Me, on the other hand, I'm quite keen to drink wines that are very, very aged. In his view, the wines I like in that mature window are kind of past best for him. And in my view, he's drinking his wines too early. But it doesn't mean that either of us are wrong. It just highlights that subjectivity and that personal aspect around wine. So the theme of tonight, the wines that have been selected because they qualify for something that we call museum release at the Wine Society. Just a little bit of background about what museum release is. The Wine Society, being member owned, no external shareholders, one of the choices that we have is we're able to invest cash in stock and in keeping stock, much more than any of our competitors could do. Because if you are a profit-driven business, cash is king, and turning that cash into dividends for external shareholders would be the kind of key measure of success. For the Wine Society, every decision we make is about member experience and, of course, the wine. And one of the advantages we have as a buying team is we get quite a substantial budget every year to invest in long-term keeping stock. And we've been doing this for a long time, for many, many, many years, and releasing those wines sort of quite quietly through our range. But what we were hearing from members was actually, could we identify those wines that the Wine Society has aged under perfect conditions? So we did some work last year and we came up with museum release. And there is a criteria. The criteria is that the wines have to have been aged by the Society, if it's a red wine, for at least 4 years, if it's a white wine, at least 2 years. That's the minimum to qualify for a museum release. Once it qualifies for a museum release, it's then down to the individual buyer to determine whether they think, their view is whether that wine is ready for drinking and ready to be released. So what we've got tonight are 6 of those wines. I think there's another 50 of them currently on our website, because we've just released quite a lot of them. So we've got 6 reds and from different countries, different vintages. And I think what we should do is probably try the first wine now, and then I can maybe talk a little bit about what happens with wine aging. So the first wine we've got is, we're in Alsace, Pinot Noir. Alsace is a region more known for its white wines. And in fact, quite rare to come across decent red wines, but that's changing. It's one of the benefits, I guess, of climate change, is that some areas that are predominantly white wines producing regions are now performing really well with red wines. Pinot Noir is a grape that has been grown in Alsace for decades. This comes from a 12th generation family, the Mure family, who actually specialize in red wines because they're based in the southern part of Alsace, just south of Colmar. Slightly warmer climate here, so really suits red grapes over the white grapes. I think the first thing I would say about this wine is if you tilt it against a sort of white background, you'll see it's a relatively pale red wine. That's very typical of thin-skinned Pinot Noir, but also the color. The color here is quite sort of mahogany in color, and that's a real indicator of an aged red wine. So as a red wine ages, the color changes. It goes from being sort of purple, ruby color right across to sort of mahogany and garnet. And we'll see some of those differences in the wines that we're trying this evening. Probably of all six, this is the one that I would say stands out the most as demonstrating that it has some age on it. It's 2015. So 7 years old, and it's a lovely sort of perfumed aroma, slightly it's got a slightly sort of herbal character because they ferment this Pinot Noir in a way they ferment whole bunches, and by fermenting the whole bunches it gives this lovely sort of lift to the aroma. And it's not a fruity wine. And again, that's very typical of aged wines. They move from being fruity in their flavor to more kind of savory in their flavors. So this is more about sort of spice and earth, and maybe a bit of sort of vegetal character too, sort of what the French call sous-bois.
Yeah, I love that sort of earthy, herbaceous note that Pinot Noir gets. Pardon, Pierre. I do love a young Pinot Noir, but it is that really, I love the Rhone term, the garrigue, that kind of dried herbaceous character. We'll go on to Rhone later. But this does remind me of that garrigue smell, particularly dried herbs.
Yeah, it is exactly that.
And I also think that color is really enchanting. I love it always reminds me of bricks. So I like that you said mahogany. It reminds me of old crumbly bricks. And then I think that goes into my mind when I'm thinking about the kind of mineral thing. Get this fake mineral element coming into my head because I know from looking at it that it's going to have that age as well.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I can't quite keep up with all of the comments as they're popping up. It's really interesting to see the comments popping up about the flavors that people are picking up. And so far, all the ones I've been able to read, you're absolutely right. I think I saw licorice, I saw hints of strawberry, smoky. And that's one of the most, I find, one of the most compelling things about a red wine that can age well is once it starts reaching its maturity, you get complexity, you get lots of different flavors. And, you know, if you can be patient this evening and not sort of drink every single wine as we go through them, I tell you, if we go through them, when this event's finished and you've got some left, go back to them. These wines are constantly evolving in the glass, which I find just such an enticing part of fine wine, and particularly in fine wines that have started to hit their kind of peak of drinkability.
And Pinot Noir has quite a funny aging curve, doesn't it, compared to some of the other varieties, particularly some of the ones that we've got later on that have the big tannins and this structure. Pinot Noir ages slightly differently compared to those. For me, I will never forget, and some members might have heard this story. I sat next to somebody, I was lucky to be invited to a very old Burgundy tasting. And I sat next to somebody who'd been bought it as a present. I was there as a student. And they turned around to me and they said, I don't like old Pinot Noir. And for their whole life, they drunk young Pinot Noir. And, it is a very, very different flavor. You start to go into bacon and smoked meats and fatty meats compared to when it's young. It's got a hugely different trajectory, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's one of those grapes, one of those styles of wines that actually is generally it's really appealing in its youth, because Pinot Noir is quite low in tannin, so it doesn't have that sort of bitterness that sort of Cabernet based wines can have, for example. And there's something so appealing about the primary fruit in Pinot Noir, that sort of red fruit character, which sort of jumps out at the glass. And then as it ages, it becomes, and I mean this positively, but it becomes more vegetal. And some people don't like that. And certainly if you like young fruity wines, you don't necessarily find that very, very appealing. Well, Anna, there was a question that popped up, which was
about the Grand Crus.
No, actually, I didn't see that one.
I'll ask that one in a moment, then I've got that in my bank. There's a question from Malcolm about why is this a wine that aged?
That's right, yes, I saw that one, and I think that's what I'd like to do actually is just step back from this wine and kind of explain kind of what makes wines age, because not every wine style does have aging sort of capacity. And it essentially comes down to the sort of constituents of what makes up a wine. So broadly, that is acidity, tannin, flavor compounds. If it's a sweet wine, sugar, of course, alcohol as well. But the key elements that matter, the key ingredients that matter for a wine to age well, you need to have good acidity. So acidity keeps the wine fresh. It gives it its lifeline. Most wines will last for many years if they have high acidity, but not all wines that have high acidity will necessarily improve for many years. In order to improve for many years, they need to have really good, healthy, quite intense levels of fruit flavor and concentration, very ripe tannins, which in some wines, when they're young, the tannins can be so present that the wines are quite hard to enjoy because it's quite an astringent wine. As the wine ages, the acidity and the tannins, so tannin is an antioxidant along with the color. So that sort of, like the acidity, gives the wine this lifeline. Tannins start to sort of they become lower or softer. They change in their molecular structure with oxygen. The dissolved oxygen in a wine converts the tannin into solids. And that's why older wines generally have sediment, because that's in fact the tannin and the color coming out in solid form. And alongside that, the fruit flavors change. Again, the action of oxygen causes the fruit flavors to change from being these primary fruity flavors to these savory secondary, tertiary flavors. So in order for a wine to age well, essentially good acidity, good ripe tannin, and good depth and concentration of fruit. And that's exactly why a wine like this has aged so well. One thing I will point out, I did just notice the tasting sheets we've sent out, the tasting note that we've printed here, actually I think is one of our historic tasting notes, because it describes the 2015. The 2015 is still young. I think that tasting note is a note from when we initially would have sold this wine when it first was released. Because I don't personally think this is still young, and I've got a feeling that our note on our website might be slightly different now. The drink date on the wine we have is to 2023, and I think that's about right. I don't think this wine's going to get any better. I think it is at its peak of maturity. Yeah, it's tasting pretty well, actually.
I've just checked, Pierre. It does say it's maturing well. So
yeah,
there
I
we
think
go.
we spotted about 2 weeks ago, it went online and we spotted that it had this old note on it. So anyway,
shame on me for being so organized.
Yes, you were too ahead of the curve, Anna.
I think it's worth mentioning really quickly before we move on, Pierre, and I will ask quickly the question as well that we had about the Grand Cru situation. But for members who may have heard that you need tannins, you need certain quality tannins, correct? Because Pinot Noir is actually one of the lower tannin varieties. So it's not necessarily the quantity of tannins that you need for aging, but you do need them to be of a good quality.
Absolutely, yeah, good point.
I think this is by far and away the lowest of the tannins of any of the wines this evening. So for members who are unsure about what tannin experience is like, then pop your seatbelt on because you're about to get some. I was just going to ask as well, we had a comment from a member around the Grand Cru, a very wise member who is clued up on their appellations of France, because there have just been 2 Grand Cru. Up until now, there have been no Grand Cru vineyards permitted in Alsace for Pinot Noir, and it's taken them about 20 years, but this year they have permitted 2 Grand Cru vineyards. However, this is actually not one of them. I think there'll probably be an argument that Rofache and this particular Clos will probably put an argument in to become one, because it's certainly, like Pierre said, famous. The flat plain at the bottom of this particular area, which is a very clay limestone area, will probably apply, I imagine. But this particular wine is not currently a Grand Cru for Pinot. So that wraps up a really charming wine. You always hear that Alsatian Pinot Noir is substandard, and I think this wine has just proved that statement wrong. So I'm really excited for what the rest of the tasting holds, Pierre. And
I'd also just like to say, just before we move from the Pinot, we really think that Alsace, along with Germany, Pinot Noir is, I'm going to use the term I hate to use, but the next big thing. We've been blown away by the quality of Pinot from both Germany and Alsace over recent vintages, in fact, German Pinot Noir members are buying 8 times as much German Pinot Noir have done in the last 12 months compared to previously. Now that comes from a very low base, but nevertheless, it's something that we're planning on promoting quite heavily next year, because they're just gorgeous wines. I'm going to pop the link as well, Pierre. I will follow up members with the links to all these wines, but I'm going to pop the link for this in the chat for this wine, and then I'll continue to do that throughout the event. But it's also worth saying, you had just really quickly, if people are interested in this kind of leaner style of Pinot Noir, you've got a very affordable wine champ Spätburgunder German, haven't you, from Martin Wassmer rather. So I'll pop that in the chat too if members are interested. Yeah, that's the wine in particular that members have been buying a lot of. If you've not tried a German Pinot Noir before and you quite like this first wine, it's worth giving it a go.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I think next up we're up for the Chinon. So
Chinon, we're in the Loire Valley, Chinon is responsible, for some of France's, I guess, most drinkable and refreshing red wines. The great variety here is Cabernet Franc. It's 100% Cabernet Franc, which is also a grape that's grown around Bordeaux. Quite a bit of Cabernet Franc grown on the right bank alongside Merlot. yeah, Jo, who buys our Loire wines, she's been squirreling away various vintages of Chinon over the years, and she's just started to release them. And this is, I have to say, this, I mean, it's 2014. The colour's extraordinary. You know, this is a wine that it actually looks younger than the 2015. It's a deeper colour, and it just has that wonderful, slightly sort of cedary, green pepper, earthy smell to it. And what sort of tobacco, I think, as well. I get a bit of tobacco on the nose too. But this is a wine that it's got fragrance. And actually, this is the sort of wine I would serve like a Pinot, not room temperature, just slightly below room temperature, just to really enhance that aroma, because it's got just such a lovely, charming, appealing nose. And then on the palate, you know, it's unmistakably Cabernet Franc. And I always think of Cabernet Franc, the tannins for me, they're kind of chalky tannins. They're very present, not at all bitter, but you can sense that structure and that lovely fine line of acidity running through the wine.
Thomas has called them grippy, and I think that's a great descriptor. They do sort of grip to the tongue in this lovely chalky fine grain texture.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Not heavy. This wine's got richness, but it's not at all heavy. It kind of refreshes the palate. I think as we move into some of these wines, what we'll notice is the tannins become a bit more present. If, like me, you haven't had your dinner, you'll start getting very, very hungry, because I think these wines do really demand food, because of that lovely sort of beautiful structure that they have. This is a vintage in the Loire, particularly in Chinon, that actually Jo was telling me that this was a vintage that at the time a couple of growers had commented to her that you'd have to actually go out of your way not to make great wine in 2014. You know, so they were sort of describing it as quite a sort of dream vintage, and it's quite rare in the Loire to have a high quality vintage for both white and for red. So this is 14's been described in the same breath as 2005 from the Loire, which was another top vintage for Cabernet Franc. Another family generation or family-owned estate, 6th generation, run by Bruno Saudet. They only make red wines. They do make a little bit of rosé, but they otherwise they're entirely entirely focused on red wines. Yeah, I think this is delicious. It's our drink date. Oh, I haven't. Yes, I have.
We've got it till 24. I think it might go a bit longer.
I think it will probably go a bit longer too. I think that's quite conservative. And actually, I ought to say, can I say something about drink dates?
Yes.
Drink dates are very controversial. I get lots of letters from members about drink dates. I think, so fair to say that our drink dates really are there for guidance. What we're trying to do as a team of buyers, the dates we're giving is our kind of best guess based on how we see these wines have aged in the past, where you're going to hit the peak. I think it's also fair to say that generally speaking, our drink dates are quite conservative. because what we don't want members to do is buy a wine from us when it's gone past its best. So in some instances, some of our drink dates can be quite cautious, particularly from areas that are perhaps have less of a track record. So areas like Bordeaux, like Burgundy, like the Rhone, there's so much history, and we have seen so many older vintages of those wines. You can be more certain. But some of the newer areas or the newer styles where there's less track record, our drink dates can be quite cautious, but they're there as guidance. And I think how you like your wines. What we're trying to do is say, this is the earliest you'd probably want to drink it if you like your wines fruity, and this is the latest if you like your wines mature.
And it's fair to say as well, Pierre, that you don't just put the number there and then leave it. You know, if you taste it, you also go back in and we'll edit it.
Thank you, Anna.
We feel like there's been a change.
We do, yeah, we do that, yeah.
Wonderful. So we've had some great member comments. Tim said he loved the Chinon, only drank it young before when it's all red fruit. This is very interesting. And I think that's true. And Catherine's actually just messaged me from behind the scenes saying this tastes more expensive, which I think is very fair. It's £16.
I know,
for a wine of this age. It just shows that there are pockets of incredible value to be found in France. I'm shocked and very, very happy at the price of this wine. So well done, Joe Locke, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And there's more to come from Chinon, from other vintages. So do watch out. Yeah.
Fabulous. Before we go on to the third wine, and I am conscious of time, Pierre, you mentioned obviously that these wines, a lot of them we're going to start moving into very foodie territory. Not for everyone, but a lot of people will want to have food. I have to say, for the first wine, I don't think it needs food, but for me, you could go for sort of the really much lighter game meats for me, but also even a chicken dish. I wouldn't go as far as dark meats, but also mushrooms for that first wine. I would love some umami flavors with kind of a mushroom risotto or something like that for that first wine. And the second wine, all I keep thinking about is Sarah Knowles, who loves slightly aged Cabernet Franc with steak frite, specifically the frite part, I think, because it does have that beautiful balance of having just enough acid to go with your ketchups and your mustards and your condiments, but also enough tannin that can be softened by the protein of the steak. So I can't stop thinking about steak frite, and I'm not having it for dinner, and I wish I were.
Yeah, and Chinon is the classic wine that, you know, if you're in Paris, the brasseries serve you Loire red wines because they just go so well with steak frite.
Ever since she told me about that combination and we did try it together, I can't do anything else with it now. It's ingrained. So let's go on to the third wine, if that's all right, Pierre, because this should be a very important wine for you, I should say, being the Spain buyer.
Yes, yeah. So this is, well, it's a special wine. We're in Rioja, which, luckily Rioja, actually, most bodegas basically age the wine for you, which is very kind of them. So they release their wines with significant bottle age. Cuné Imperial is Cuné's sort of top level wine, and they make a Reserva and a Gran Reserva. And Gran Reserva is generally released about 6 years following the vintage, 6 or 7 years. So this would have been released about 2016, 2017. And 2010 was a 5-star vintage in Rioja, and probably the best vintage since 2005. This is a wine that is made to reflect, real sort of traditional style of Rioja. So it's aged for about 3 years in barrel. Probably 2 years in barrel, and it's a mix of French and American. And the American oak gives it that nice sort of exotic character. The thing that they do, again, which is very typical of Rioja Gran Reservas, is whilst that's aging in barrel, they do regular rackings. And a racking is when they move the wine from one barrel into another barrel. And they do that in order to clarify the wine. So what happens, the wine's in the barrel, and over several months, the sediment falls to the bottom. They take the wine off the sediment, put it into another barrel where it then rests again for another 4 to 6 months, and they repeat that process. That racking basically means that the wine is filtered naturally. But importantly, what it does is it introduces more oxygen into the wine. And introducing more oxygen into the wine means that the wines start to almost, in a sense, it's sort of mimicking the aging process that happens in bottle. And so it softens the tannins and helps the oak flavor integrate. This would have been put into bottle after about 2.5 years, then stayed in bottle aging in the bodega for about 3 to 4 years, and then released. It's got a lovely sort of creamy, leathery kind of character to it.
Yeah, on the first nose, when I nosed them all earlier, when I just poured them, so I said to Pierre, I've nosed them but not tasted them because I wanted to taste along with members. When I first nosed it, it was very much the cedar and the French that came to me initially. And now that it's had a bit more time in the glass, I'm getting far more of that coconut, that sweet spice, that kind of vanilla, almost nutmeg aromas. So it's amazing just from, what is it, an hour and something, how much development I've already seen in the glass. So your point earlier to members about keeping a bit and seeing how it evolves, it's already completely changed for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really, a lot of that is the oak. Oak is such an important characteristic that is so much part of Rioja's identity. And those flavors that you were mentioning are all about the oak. And it's amazing because when you compare it, so the Chinon, that has seen, I think, 0 new oak. No, I'm certain it's seen no new oak at all. So we've gone from a wine with no new oak character at all to a wine that is really expressive in terms of its oak and intentionally quite an oaky wine. I think this is actually quite backward. To me, it's showing it's still kind of curled up a little bit. And I agree, Anna. I think in the glass, this is just going to carry on evolving. If I had this in my own cellar, I would keep it for a bit longer. I think it will. And this wine, I've been privileged to be able to taste Imperial Gran Reservas from 50, 60, 70 years old, and they just keep on going. We've got a very special release from this wine to celebrate our 150th anniversary in a few years, and I can't say any more than that. We've got a very special release of this wine.
You're wetting everyone's whistle, though, that's for sure. I'll now be inundated with emails. I think the nice thing as well, Pierre, that you've touched on it is you've put 2035, I think, is the drink window for this. But those really lovely Gran Reserva Riojas, they've already, I remember somebody years and years ago talking about barrel aging and that racking and that oxygen exposure almost as a vaccination against oxidation in the future. It's already had a bit of the oxygen, so you're not sort of wrapping it in cotton wool and then letting it degrade fast. It's almost ready to degrade slowly. It's a strange way to describe it.
No, I totally, absolutely. This wine has been exposed to oxygen and it's reacted accordingly, and it makes it so much more robust against the gradual controlled oxidation that happens in bottle during aging, which is why this, I think, if you can, I guarantee if you left this in the glass, I think it would taste amazing in 24 hours because it won't have gone off. So yeah, it's got a huge amount of intensity, hasn't it, and length of flavour. It's going to get better though. I think it's going to get even better than it is showing today. But it's got all of the right things in the right place.
Yeah, amazing. We've got two questions. So Ewan's asked about whether it's fermented in oak, and I believe it is, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it will be fermented in oak. Yeah.
And then Damien and Tricia have and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. They have a great question considering what we've just been talking about leaving it in the glass. They've asked your view on the length of time to open and decant an aged wine versus a new wine. And they've said that generally they reduce the time in a decanter as the wine ages.
Great question.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, really great question. So my rule of thumb is exactly that rule of thumb. So the younger a wine is, you can decant it several hours in advance. The older a wine is, it becomes more and more fragile and more delicate, and therefore I would generally decant it for a shorter or just before serving. I think, I mean, every wine is different, and so generally more delicate wines, even in their youth, so things like Pinot Noir, generally I wouldn't necessarily decant. Bigger, richer, more powerful wines, particularly Bordeaux blends, Rhone style wines, Portuguese fine red wines, Italians, they generally do benefit from being decanted. The kind of, when they're at the, I guess, that peak window of drinkability, I would normally pull the cork, take a little taste, or just smell it. And if it's really, really closed, or if it's a bit stinky, because some wines can get a bit of sort of weird sort of bottle shock when they've been in bottle for a while and you pull the cork. If it's a little bit stinky, I might decant it for a good hour before. If it's jumping out in the glass, I just put the cork back in and I'll decant it just before serving. Because, of course, the other benefit of decanting is that you are taking the wine off any sediment, because it's not pleasant unless, you know, sediment's harmless, but it's a much nicer experience to be drinking a wine in glass that hasn't got a load of sediment in it. So really, really old wines, yeah, I would pull the cork and sometimes not even decant them because they're so fragile.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pierre. Great answer. So Damien and Tricia, you were on the right track. I'm conscious of time, Pierre, as much as I feel like we could be here for another 2 hours. It would be a lovely evening, but I am conscious of time. We've got 3 more wines to talk about. We're going to sort of move into maybe a more powerful trio, perhaps, is a way to describe it. So members, I would suggest if you would had a plate of cheese or crackers or anything that you might fancy nibbling on, even some crisps, nothing too strong. We do want to focus on the wine, but if you wanted to, these 3 wines are certainly food style wines, particularly I think some of the ones we're about to taste. If you fancied it, go for it. I'm not going to. I'm going to enjoy the wines as they are, but by all means, when Pierre mentioned foodie wines, we're definitely moving up into the food territory here. On that note, I will just say, Pierre, when Pierre kindly set me up with a Cune meeting when I was in Rioja in April, and at the tasting we talked about Imperial, and I asked about food matches, and they actually said this is the wine for after dinner. That's the thinking wine, which I thought was very interesting. I'd never heard it described as that before, and obviously it goes with lots of foods, particularly lamb is the Riojan favorite, I suppose, which luckily I am having for dinner tonight, possibly on purpose. But it's interesting that they said that the Imperial was a wine that you could serve after dinner, and they even described it as it's instead of a cognac sort of thing, which I thought was lovely. Yeah.
Vino de meditation, they call it. Meditation.
Perfect. Absolutely. I'll meditate. Post lamb, I think I'll be meditating with that all evening. It's delicious. So lovely. We're going to move on to our only non-European wine actually this evening, which is the Villafante from South Africa. So I will, members, if you haven't got it in your glass form, number 4, and I will also pop that into the chat. So thank you.
Yeah, Villafante, Series M 2014. So this is quite a remarkable combination of winemaking talent, international winemaking talent. So it's basically the brainchild of 3 people. One is Mike Ratcliffe from South Africa. He is who heads up a Warwick estate, very well known, very established fine wine from South Africa, and he partnered with 2 US winemakers, Zelma Long and Phil Fries, both who have worked at Mondavi in California, and make Villafante. Villafante is the name of the local soil there. Series M refers to the fact that this is majority Merlot and Malbec. It does have a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon as well. I've never tried this wine before. I have to say it's absolutely gorgeous. It's got incredibly pure fruit flavors. And I mean, I would describe this as a wine that has sort of young puppy fat aromas and flavor, but it's soft and smooth. The tannins are just, I mean, they're present, but you could, I mean, it's just gorgeous. It's plummy. And I think it's quite the thing that I'm sort of contemplating in my mind is this philosophical question of wines from the Southern Hemisphere in terms of their ageability, drinkability. Some and most of the wines from these areas, the top wines, actually they're absolutely gorgeous to drink when they're young. They don't have the same grippy tannic backbone that classic areas have. And of course, they have the benefit of that sort of lovely ripe fruit flavor. So they can be really enjoyable young, but in the right hands, they can also age very, very well. You know, this is aging really slowly. It's 2014. Our drink date is to 2030. I think we'll easily reach that. And as this wine ages, it will just mellow more and probably lose a bit of that cassis and plummy fruit. And that will become a bit more sort of cedary, a bit more savory. But yeah, I have to say this is proving to be one of my favorites so far this evening. It's gorgeous, delicious wine. Don't know what the alcohol. I haven't got that in front of me, but it doesn't feel heavy either.
It's 14%, which for a Pale wine in South Africa is quite restrained, should I say?
Yeah,
so it can get rather warm down there. The other thing I think that's lovely about these wines, Pierre, is we do sell them on Primeur. So this is M series, but we also sell C series, which is the Cabernet dominated version. So all from the same site, but they decided that the Malbec and Merlot needed to shine in one and the Cabernet needed to shine in the other. And we're really lucky at the Wine Society. I think we get first dibs. So we release these wines. My understanding is we release these wines before anyone else can buy them on Primeur. So if members decide they like this style, we've been championing it, and Joe's been championing it for a long time, and it is part of our sort of modern on Primeur series, which is wonderful. they're fabulous wines, and they obviously hold with age.
Exactly, yeah.
I've got a question in the chat, but I'm just going to use it. Use it. I'm just going to save that for towards the end, if that's all right, because I am conscious of time. I think for me, it would be nice, particularly because it is a Bordeaux blend, if we can talk about the next wine and then maybe compare them. How do you feel about that, Pierre? Because they do share some common grape varieties.
They certainly do. Yeah, so yes, it's Gassac, isn't it? Domas Gassac. Perhaps a name that doesn't need too much introduction. One of the probably most famous names from the south of France. I think it was once described. It's a relatively newish wine. Only started in 1970s, which is pretty new for a wine that's established such a kind of almost a cult sort of following. I think it has been described as sort of the Lafite of the Languedoc. It's quite a fascinating story. A family, the Guibert family, bought the property. There were no vines there. They were thinking of planting olive trees, but a friend of theirs who was a leading authority on vineyard geology, vineyard soils, happened to visit them and just went weak at the knees when he saw the site and said, "No, you've got to plant grapes here." So they planted grapes. They planted a whole host of different grape varieties. Anna, you've got that list, haven't you? Could you read that through? Because I'm never going to remember it. I haven't got it in front of me. But
I don't blame you not remembering it. Yeah, there's Cabernet Sauvignon dominance. That's why it's quite nice to taste these side by side. So 72% Cabernet. Then it's 5% Merlot, as was also in the last wine, 5 Tannat, and then 4 Cabernet Franc, 2 Malbec, 2 Pinot Noir, and then 9% of various rare grape varieties. So they have all sorts of things in there like Nebbiolo, Dolcetto. So they've got Italian varieties, they've got French varieties, and they sort of make up that final 9%. But Cabernet dominant with a lot of those classic Bordeaux varieties, so Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and then also the Tannat, which is a southwesterly, if not Bordelais, but certainly southwest France variety.
It's so distinctive, isn't it? It's got its own. I think it's a very individual wine. It does have a nod to Bordeaux, I think, in its structure, and it's got that lovely sort of punchy backbone. But it's not Bordeaux. It's got the sort of personality of southern France and the Languedoc. It's got a lovely kind of Mediterranean feel, but Mediterranean flavors, not the Mediterranean. Some southern Mediterranean wines can be really quite high and alcoholic. This isn't at all. I think this is 13.5%. It's got freshness, yet Mediterranean characters. I think it's an intriguing wine. This is sort of wine that it would be a really nasty wine to give a wine professional blind and to ask them to try and guess where it comes from. What I think you could say if you were given it blind is you can sense the quality here. It's a really complete wine, very well integrated, drinking incredibly well now. It's got the structure to carry on aging for several more years. But yeah, I mean, it really interesting to compare it to the previous wine, which is a more modern wine and lovely for it, whereas this I think is a more kind of it's got a kind of rusticity about it, a rustic quality.
What I find interesting,
I could talk about for a long time.
Exactly, slowly unpick it. It's a real detective wine.
Yeah.
What I find interesting though is the previous wine, so the Villafonte. It was very fruity on the nose, and then the palate had that more savoury notes. For this one, I'm finding the opposite. I find it very savoury and herbaceous on the nose, but actually on the palate, it has got this plump, juicy, fruity component. So they're almost opposites of each other in some ways. They're a really lovely contradiction. Yeah, I mean, going back, I adore side-by-side tastings like that. I've just gone back to go and smell the Villafronte. It almost smells confected, next to the herbaceous and earthy tones of number 5. Catherine's written a lovely tasting note in the chat as well, that it's got an almost balsamic quality to it, number 5.
It definitely has, actually, yeah.
I think that's great.
This is a wine with complexity, isn't it?
It really is.
This is like wine 1, like wine 1 and 3, I think in particular, have got this. You'll keep going back to the glass and go, wow, which reminds me of why I got into wine, because when I was at university, I was going home. My dad was just getting into fine wine, and every time I went home and he served a wine, I couldn't get over the fact that I was drinking something called wine, which I was also drinking at university. But when I was at home with my dad, this same stuff called wine, every time I picked the glass up, that same wine kept changing, kept evolving, and I was fascinated by it. And I think that's the beauty of fine wine and aged wine, isn't it? We're very lucky to be trying these this evening. Yeah,
I completely agree. And that is exactly the beauty of it. I think now actually would be a good time to ask the question that I had banked before we move on to the final wine, because it is not necessarily about the wine changing in the glass, but John has asked that he sees plenty of notes about wines as they age, suggesting that they're great young, close down, and then develop complexity later. So I suppose it's a question around, why do some wines have this closed, or some people call it dumb period? And then the $1 million question, how do you know if a wine is in that period? This is a bit of a $1 million question, so I apologize, Pierre.
Yeah,
I think it's a good time to address it.
But wines do go. They definitely go through stages, phases. You know what? I think I would be incredibly wealthy if I had the formula. Even within months, and as a buyer, I have that privilege of tasting lots of wines and often focusing in on one wine and maybe tasting it across a period of 6 months. The same wine over a different period of just 6 months can go through slight changes. So yeah, it's quite hard. I mean, earlier today at Stevenage, we had Frederic Cassager come over from the owner of Chateau Bataille in Bordeaux, and he did a tasting for staff of 4 or 5 vintages of Chateau Bataille, and he was referring to the sort of the windows that wines go through, and he said the same. You can't predict it. His recommendation was buy a case of the same wine and try a bottle. If it's not ready or to your taste, then hold it back. I think the other great thing actually today as well, that's really risk-free of doing that, is using a Coravin. I think they're incredibly good. They work really well. It means you can just draw the wine out without pulling the cork, and then it protects the wine, so you can take a little taster and so on. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't have the answer to why wines go through different phases.
I think we're also very fortunate in the modern world that the internet can update in real time, and you will often find journalists or fellow wine lovers are writing, to the minute reports. And if you go on websites like Jancis Robinson or other critics, they'll often have a taste date, won't they, next to when they tasted the wine, so it can give you an idea. So you might have a taste date that's saying this is drinking beautifully, but it will often have the reference next to it as to when that note was written. So you can, you can spot, should I say, when things are being recently tasted, and if they're being recently tasted and receiving good reviews, then it's a good time to drink. Whereas in many moons ago, you wouldn't have that luxury of being able to sort of Google it and see if you've got any any up-to-date tasting notes. So that's the other thing, a little bit of research. But I live with my Coravin. I think it's fantastic. So I do encourage members to, if they can afford to do so, it's a great thing to have. I'm very conscious of time now, but I'm loving this so much that I hope members won't mind, in the same way that I don't mind continuing on. I think we had suggested that this would be more like 8:10 finish. So that will give us a lovely way to end the evening and plenty of time to go on to wine number 6. So we've got our final wine of the evening, the Rhone.
Yeah, you definitely need to be sitting down for this wine. Châteauneuf du Pape Jeunesse, 2016. What makes this wine quite different or unique for Châteauneuf is it is 100% of one grape variety. And most Châteauneuf is a blend of 8-9 different grape varieties, of which Grenache plays a key role. Syrah plays a key role, Mourvèdre plays a key role. This is 100% Grenache from a vineyard that is north facing and a vineyard with really low yields, incredibly low yields, about sort of 28 hectolitres per hectare, which, to put that into context, a Bordeaux chateau, their yield would be at least 3 or 4 times that size. This is a really kind of weighty, full-bodied, I think I'm going to use the word opulent, actually, in terms of its texture. It's got that really high quality Grenache, often reminds me of quince. It's got a sort of quince character, where it's is really ripe. If it was any riper, it would be overripe, but it isn't overripe. It's just on the edge of being at the ripest it can be without being overripe. The tannins are quite soft, which is typical of Grenache. I imagine that this wine a few years ago would have been quite a bruiser. I think the tannins would have probably stood out separately. You and I agree, it's almost porty. Yeah, it's got that porty, that sort of quince character, without the fortified character. Although this is kick in at 15% alcohol. The thing about Grenache is that Grenache, in order to reach flavor ripeness, it has to reach quite high levels of sugar ripeness. And that's why ripe Grenache tends to be quite high in alcohol here at 15%. But it's really balanced. I mean, you wouldn't, you can sense the weight, that opulence, which I think comes from the alcohol, but you don't get that real burn or heat on the finish because there's so much fruit to support the wine.
And I think, there's obviously various different soil types, even within Châteauneuf. Everybody thinks it's all the Gallet stones. And it's not necessarily true. There are lots of those, but this is quite a sandy site, which supposedly helps. And I'm sure that's very true. There's a bit less reflection from the sun. So you don't get overcooked fruit. And 2016 was a very dry year. I think 70 millimeters of rainfall the whole summer. So not dissimilar to the year we've actually just had in the Southern Rhone. So very dry, warm, lots of temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius. So lots and lots of warm weather. And because Grenache likes the sun, as Pierre has just suggested, so that's a good thing. But the soils here, not having too many Gallet, being on the sandier soils, having that northerly exposure that Pierre mentioned, means that it is still refreshing whilst also being full and rich, and
Yeah.
some Andy's written blackberry, which I think really warm Grenache does get that black fruit flavour. It's very much moved on from the red. And Thomas has said figgy, which I think is a lovely description. It's definitely a food wine though, yes.
Yeah, for me, this is sort of cheese territory. I think it's not a sweet wine, but the fruit has got a sweetness about it, and I think that goes really well with the sort of salty cheeses like cheddar. It's a wine to have towards the end of a meal.
Yeah, I agree. I think too early on and your palate's sort of shot for much else. So yes, I'm glad we put this last. I think it's worth saying that some, the cooler years of Chateauneuf du Pape don't always end up this way. Sometimes they can almost, or Rhone wines in general, particularly that Grenache, can sometimes move towards, and I'd never say it's like the first Pinot, but it has sometimes got some of that red, more spiced character, whereas this is very, very rich. I do think it's black. I think it is borderline confected fruit, like you say. It's just on that edge. But it's quite fun to have a wine that's just on the edge and enjoying that indulgence, that luxury, opulence, all of those words.
Yeah.
And those tannins, I think, are beautiful because they're there, but very soft.
They're soft. They're quite silky, aren't they?
Yeah. So we didn't mention, and I feel bad for not doing it now, but we didn't actually mention any food pairings for 4 and 5. So our South African, I must be honest, is for me Bry territory. For anyone who doesn't follow the South African wine trade, it's Cape wine at the moment. And I'm sat with huge envy at Joe and Matthew, our buyers, who are currently sort of wandering their way around various South African vineyards, tasting beautifully smoky cooked meats alongside, I imagine, wines exactly like number 4. So yeah, smoky meats. And if you're going for, I think because of the fruit nature of number 4, for me, sweeter vegetable dishes. So things like when you grill an aubergine and you get that nice caramelized onions in particular, I think would be lovely with this. So those sorts of vegetable flavors. Number 5, conversely, because it does have that slightly more savory character, I'd be going for things like lentils for number 5. That kind of slightly more earthy tone, maybe beetroot has a lovely earthiness to it that might go with that wine. And then probably, because I don't think on the palate it's got the same tannin structure, it has got slightly easier tannins for me, I'd probably go for things like bangers and mash. That would be a fun that would be a really fun combination, a cult classic, the Lafite of the Languedoc alongside bangers and mash. I think I'm going to have to recreate it. And then yes, like we said, that last wine for me, totally couldn't have said anything better, Pierre. That's a cheese wine for me. That's the final wine of the night to be savoured over with some cheeses. Delicious. Absolutely delicious. So Pierre, I'm not going to ask you yet. I'm going to ask members first. So Catherine, if you're happy to put the poll up to ask the favourite wine, I've just popped the last wine link in the chat. Pierre, you're not allowed to vote because you're a panelist, but I'm going to wait until the results come in and then I'm going to ask your opinion. But members, you'll see all the wines there.
My opinion will be I will agree with the members.
How very political of you. Well, members, do click, and remember, if there's more than one of you tasting this evening, you are welcome to click more than one. We've had a member that did have the last wine with the cheese, so that's great. Well done. You were more prepared than Pierre and I were.
Yeah.
We're now both starving, but I must say I'm excited for my rioja with my rioja with my lamb. Robert said I would have a wonderful holiday affair with the Chateauneuf du Pape, but marry the rioja, which I think is fabulous. Thank you, Robert. Right, I think we're probably done for the poll. So Catherine, if you can please, I don't know the answers yet. Catherine's going to flash them up on the screen. So if you can release the results, please, that would be wonderful. Oh, there we go. Gosh, votes for everything, which is always nice. So the winning wine, members, if you're not able to see is the Rioja with 42%. So well done, Pierre. We should have had a buyer off. Then we've got the Chateauneuf de Pape coming in with 30% of the votes. That was second. We've then got the Mas de Dumas, then the Pinot Noir, then the Villafranche, and finally the Chinon. So we've got a really, I'm really pleased that everything got a vote. That's great.
Yeah.
Pierre, for do we even need to ask what was your favorite?
You know, I'm the Rioja buyer, so I'm chuffed to bits. But no, I think it's. I mean, look, it just shows, doesn't it, that, as you said, when you get a vote for every wine, these wines all have personality, and that's the thing about fine wine, and particularly aged wines. They have such strong personalities, and I think it's quite, you know, you have your own personal taste. So yeah, I don't know what my favorite. I mean, I'm going back to them all the time, but I think I've got a quite kind of I'm liking the Damascasac, actually. I'm finding it the most intriguing wine. I'm not sure it's the wine that is the most pleasurable, but because it's intriguing, I keep going back to it. And the Chateauneuf is, I think it's one of those wines that whoever your audience or your guests are, whether you're really into wine or you just like drinking wine, you couldn't fail to go, wow, that's got something pretty special.
Absolutely. I think that's an amazing way to sum up the evening, actually, Pierre. Everything does have something special, and there's definitely a place for all of these wines. So thank you. Thank you to Catherine behind the scenes tonight. She did get a pack. Don't worry, members. I was kind to her. And she's just sent me her vote, and she said the Rioja followed by the Pinot. So there we go. Another vote for the Rioja. But thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you all members for joining. I will be sending up a follow-up email, but we do hope to do lots more of these. So keep your eyes peeled. In the next few weeks, you'll see a lot more events with tasting packs going online. We've got some packs left for the Warwick vertical, so we've got 6 different vintages of Warwick. So if you like the Villafranche, it is a Bordeaux blend from South Africa, and then we'll have plenty more various styles and different producers, and also fine wine and museum releases like this evening coming up next year. So thank you, and then the biggest thanks to Pierre. It didn't take much persuading when I sent you the list of wines. Would you mind coming and talking about these 6 wines? I got quite a quick yes, member. So hopefully we'll have you back again, Pierre. But honestly, a huge thank you. I'm going to toast the Rioja because that makes sense, I think, to toast your wine to you.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us for these events. We do love doing them, and keep telling us how we can improve them, and if you like them, we'll do more of them. And congratulations, by the way, to Anna, Catherine and the tastings team, because 2 years in a row we've won Best Virtual Wine Experience from Decanter Magazine, which is amazing. So anyway, good stuff. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.